Hello again, ColemanNation. I'm not saying hello, ColemanNation, because it's really ColemanNation. You know that, right? We've been through this. Norm Pattis. Now, there's a well-known lawyer. Okay, don't give me this Twitter stuff. Norm Pattis is a guy who has been the real deal. For Norm, you've been practicing since William Jennings Bryan, right? I mean, I know that you've been out there for a very, very long time. You've done a lot of exciting things. Norm is besides doing a lot of civil rights work, and he's known as a criminal law attorney in Connecticut, but of course he has a national practice, like all us fancy guys do. And I was on Norm's podcast, which we recorded, I guess a month or so ago, and it dropped a few weeks ago, and I shared all that with you, and I'm sure that none of you have forgotten a moment of it. Thanks for joining us, Norm.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. I can't remember, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the name of the publishing company, but I ordered a book on the Talmud on your recommendation. And thank you so much for the time you offered me, and thanks for the time now. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Well, I bet that does now put me in. That's a lot of pressure, but I think we can handle it, both of us.
Yeah.
There's so much going on that is of mutual interest. Even though I think we don't necessarily share exactly the same political views, of course, I would shudder to think of anyone sharing the exact same views on anything, although I think there's increasingly the homogenization of the views that a person is permitted to hold is proceeding apace. You have been an outstanding critic of the criminal justice system for a long time, as any criminal defense lawyer would have to be, just by virtue of observing how things work there. Has anything gotten better, or have things gotten worse in the last 10 years?
That's a great question. My first impression of the criminal justice system was shock. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I assumed that there was something wrong with my vision. And so, and maybe I didn't have enough experience. Maybe I wasn't asking the right questions. Maybe I hadn't read enough cases. Maybe I hadn't spoke to enough people. So I wandered around, and then I just concluded, no, it really is outrageous what goes on here in terms like the trial tax, in terms of the heinous crime exception to the Bill of Rights, in terms of double jeopardy and the successive trial problems, excessive bonds, And so have things gotten better or worse in the last 10 years? I remember sitting in a car with my then partner, John Williams, in New Haven when we learned about the new Department of Homeland Security. Or more to the point, I'm in the Northeast. I was in the shadow of the World Trade Center towers a day before they fell, leaving the Second Circuit. And the minute those planes struck, I thought, this is the most dangerous time in American history for the Fourth Amendment, because security is going to trump the rights that we cherish. And so I think within the last 2 years, and it is so, we've got the surveillance state, we've got broad cooperation between private entities and the government in obtaining information. I mean, we did see the third party doctrine peeled back a little bit recently by the Supreme Court. But I think the thing that has me most concerned right now is what I would refer to as a republic of virtue, the public health state. And so we've been engaged, and I haven't seen that trickle down much into the criminal justice system, but it's going to happen.
Oh, it definitely is, because we've gone from fiat government under rolling emergency decrees. We can do everything virtually except vote on legislation, it seems.
Yeah.
For some reason, legislators have to be in person, or you got to ramp them up with arrest warrants,
in
order to get them to vote on something. So you have this executive decree system, and you send these hapless sheriffs out to shut down gyms and events and bar mitzvahs, and then you're definitely, I think we are going to see, with all this talk about the vaccine passports, a criminalization. And what has been astonishing to me, both participating in hearings over these issues, and Harmeet and I were, as you know, my partner's Harmeet Dillon.
Yeah.
We were very involved last year in challenges to COVID rules on First Amendment grounds. The experience of hearing judges and this is much like what you were just, the things you were listing off, just defer to an emergency decree
Absolutely.
as if it were entitled to some presumption,
I hear you.
or as if that presumption were essentially irrebuttable.
Well,
But they didn't even go to that level of analysis.
No, I mean, and it's almost like hysteria has become the norm. So much in the public health context, if you look at the 1905 decision of Massachusetts versus Jacobson, I mean, that was a decision upholding the Bay State's right to impose smallpox vaccinations on people. That case is recited throughout the land as binding authority. But let's face it, that was a pre-incorporation of the First Amendment case. And if you actually read the decision, it was kind of ludicrous. I mean, these were lawyers who thought you could argue the preamble of the Declaration of Independence as binding authority. That wouldn't pass muster in a law school these days, much less a courtroom. And so when you try to engage a judge in a serious discussion of incorporation, there is this default deference to the state and to the state's imperatives. And this pandemic is now becoming the new normal as we morph into discussions of an endemic and endless variations. But yet the body of law remains. And I think it's going to be imposed on and relied upon for curtailing the Second Amendment. I've seen people refer to quote unquote systemic racism as a public health problem. And then, of course, there is, in my view, at least, the very real problem of climate change. All of these claims will be revived or reinvigorated by the body of law we create now. And where's the Bill of Rights? And so, you talk about changes in the criminal justice system in the last 10 years. I guess what I would say is there's a wanton disregard of the Bill of Rights, and their role is real and substantial limits in favor of some sort of consequentialist view that we want a better society, therefore we'll ditch the Bill of Rights. That's just not how I was brought up, and I'm prepared to fight that,
Well, where's the rest of the criminal defense bar? That's what I don't understand.
I know. So that it's we are now a year and a half into effective closed courts. And so in Connecticut, at least, where I spend most of my time, I used to see members of the bar in court, and we'd go to pre-trials. We'd observe one another's trials.
You're talking about an important phenomenon of this moment, which is the unthreading of the fabric of social existence that is so important, not only in neighborhoods among everyday people interacting regardless of their social stratum, but within strata themselves.
Absolutely. I don't know where young lawyers are going to learn things. The sense of what is and isn't reasonable in a plea bargaining context, for example, I acquired from years of trial and error and observation. And now I don't have access to that. There are virtual hearings, and I may see a judge from time to time online, but there have been no trials in Connecticut to speak of, a handful. I mean, there are exceptions. And the buzz around the state is that we're heading for another lockdown. So I was at lunch with a friend of mine the other day. I said, it could be 2 years, ultimately, from the time I last tried a case to the time I next tried one. That's bad for society, in my view. Trial is the acid test. It's where you say to the government, you may believe it, but can you prove it? And I think in the absence of proof, the business of living together in government goes on. So we are becoming habituated to obedience, and that isn't good.
It really isn't. And there's to me, the problem with the role of, we saw something happen during the Trump years where a decision was made, or a consensus was reached. It's the same kind of consequentialism that you just referred to, where the concept that you and I did grow up with, which was that there's a lawyer for every single client, and being the lawyer for that client was not remotely associated with agreeing with that client's point of view.
Yeah.
And by the time the election was over in the fall, they were posting lists of law firms to pressure for representing the president of the United States. Why? Because he was the wrong president.
Yeah.
And you and I are old enough to recognize that Trump derangement syndrome, and you don't have to be a conservative to believe that there's such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome, is just a variation on what the venom that was attached to Nixon.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And before our time, the way a good quarter of the country that you never hear about in the history books hated Roosevelt,
Yeah, yeah.
despised Roosevelt, despised him. But only now do you have this idea that it's okay if someone doesn't get justice, or someone doesn't have the opportunity to be heard in any kind of penal or even administrative. How about disbarring Rudy or suspending Rudy Giuliani's license? The guy wasn't even given a hearing himself.
No, I realize that was an astonishing decision. I actually read it. There's a preliminary way to remove a person without a hearing if they pose an extraordinary threat to consumers or to clients. What's the extraordinary threat? I mean, he and Sidney Powell shot themselves in the foot. I had enormous respect for Sidney Powell going into the litigation. I thought the work she did for Ted Stevens was outstanding. The work she did for the National Security Advisor, whose name I'm blanking on, was Michael Flynn, was outstanding. And so when she said she had something, I said to people, well, this ought to be interesting. And they put up her shut up time, she failed. Now, should she be sanctioned for filing frivolous litigation? Maybe, and a court will have to make that decision. But you know what? I'm entitled as a lawyer, and people ought to be entitled to have as their lawyer a person who's ready, willing, and able to go in and advance an unpopular cause. And if I don't have the evidence to support it, I lose. But do I lose my law license? What was the threat that Rudy Giuliani posed? He made a fool of himself in some respects, in my view. But so I've done that, been there, done that, and I don't want to sacrifice my life or my license because I'm sometimes a knucklehead. But yet people are fine with that. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at Ben Shapiro's new book, The Daily Wire, The Authoritarian Moment. I actually think he nailed it. There is a growing sense of unctuousness, of self-righteousness, of the conclusion that the ends justify the means, and if we disagree with your ends, it doesn't matter what means you use or we use. We will silence you. And why? We're losing something fundamental. We're losing the ability to dissent. We're losing tolerance for dissent. We're losing the ability to think.
I mean, and you see that when you have people who associate with with a movement or a political party that is known as liberal, who then go and say, it's okay if a social media platform kicks somebody off because it's private property.
Yeah.
Since when were you so big on private property?
Yeah.
I mean, so typically, historically, it would be the role of lawyers to, not maybe the role of lawyers alone, but it would be an important role of lawyers to push back on this. And there's a great intimidation factor, not only at the level of criminalizing or sanctioning behavior, but even merely speaking out. I can't tell you how many private messages I get from anonymous lawyers who tell me that they love what I do. They wish they could speak out too, but they're afraid for their jobs, and they should be, because I got fired from my last job for the kind of work that I do, representing kind of clients.
Wow.
It's reality. I mean, that's why I'm with Harmeet now, because we're that kind of lunatic.
Wow. Well, I don't have that problem because, I work for a complete asshole. And, and
well, that's what so when Harmeet came to me and said, I wanted that opportunity too. She said, no, I can provide you with that.
Because I've been self-employed for so long. I mean, my harshest critic is my wife. And frankly, she's pretty critical. I mean, she's been living in our summer home for the last 4 months. I'm not sure she's coming back because, she's further to the left than I am. I'm hoping that the love we shared over decades will be enough to repair things. But, there are fundamental divisions in this country. And I don't see young lawyers standing up and standing out. I have a couple really good ones working for me right now. And both of them, I have many, but these two in particular, they won't get vaccinated for religious reasons. And their view is that because the vaccine is produced in part from stem cells derived from fetuses, that's inconsistent with their principles. And it makes for awkward discussions around the office among those of us who are vaccinated. but I respect their decisions. And I'm proud to be able to accommodate them, and I'll back the fights they pick on the name of those principles. I don't think a lot of law firms are prepared to do that anymore.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
And what I can tell you from my own experience is that it's not only, I had a very interesting discussion with a guy named Adam Townsend, who's a very successful investor on the West Coast and who does a lot of social media, mostly Twitter Periscope videos. And he's really a guy who sees things through a unique prism. And one of the things that he has observed is that you have a sort of a revolution from the bottom going on now. And he associates it with Chinese infiltration into American society. But without even getting that specific, you could still contrast it with, in China, the way businesses and institutions are controlled is that the Communist Party makes sure that management and boards of entities have sufficient party representation on them, that decisions made at the top are politically correct. In America, your junior employees, your support staff, and your vendors tell management what to do.
Yeah.
So you end up in a place where Victoria's Secret, which for years was known as being pioneers in the field of advertising, lingerie, utilizing some of the most beautiful women in the world.
It was a hot spot. Yeah.
Is now trying to sell that same merchandise, selling morbidly obese, using morbidly obese models to somehow remedy something or get a, and that that no one in the marketing department, well, maybe they can't even say it, right? Because they're also facing these,
Well, so here's what I think, and I think the Victoria's Secret thing illustrates it perfectly. I like Aristotle's ethics. I like the ancient Greeks. I like the discussion of excellence. And
That's nice, because they speak very highly of you, I should point out.
All those dead guys. Yeah, you get beyond the age of 60 and you and death, you become intimately familiar with death. I can, I'm going to turn 66 in September, and I've been in psychoanalysis for a better part of 12, 13 years now. And as I said to my analyst the other day, getting old has its benefits. I used to fear death. Now I'm adjusting to it. I sense within a decade or so, it'll become a friend such that when it ultimately comes, it will be welcome. And that's, of course, assuming I live that long, and that remains to be seen. But to return to Victoria's Secret, here's, I think, what's at stake. I like to say the bottom has fallen out of pluralism, that we're spending cultural capital that we're not replacing. What do I mean? We have an ancient tradition, an ancient Judeo-Christian tradition with sacred text, canonical authors, and people were trained for decades and generations to respect and interpret them and look for their lineage in their own lives, to conform to models and visions of righteousness or excellence. You can't do that anymore. And the result is a race to the bottom and an inability to tell better from worse. Thus, a morbidly obese chick in a bikini can be as beautiful as a live model.
Because everyone has his own truth.
Right, and they have their own truth, and we're all, and the victim of the month, and yet we need an energizing principle in life, and it's become pathos. And victimhood is the new road to sainthood. So, if you've got to be lithe to be a model, no, you should be obese. Soon we'll be craving photographs of obese amputees with PTSD and learning disabilities. It's just, I don't mock the fact that some people face those challenges in life, and my heart goes out to them, but I'm not going to call them beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that a Victoria's Secret's model is. Their character may be beautiful, but I've got a confession to make. When I'm looking at a Victoria's Secret's model, I'm not wondering what the last book she read is. It's eye candy, and it may be semi-pornographic eye candy, but that's what it is. But we're now saying everybody has to be everything. We've lost the ability to make any distinctions, and all we like sheep.
So this is Michael Knowles's thesis.
Yeah.
This is what he writes about: is the ability to make distinctions and language has lost its meaning, and as lawyers, that should trouble us very much. And it's something that the right has been screaming about in constitutional jurisprudence for a long time. And I'm sure that there have been moments when the shoe has been on the other foot as well. But judges, we've known for a long time, those of us who practice for decades, that if a judge wants to go somewhere, there's no statute or precedent that's going to stop him or her from going there. They're going to find a way. And, I had a trademark case where the judge had issued a previous opinion where he said, well, there was no secondary meaning, there was no trademark meaning in that trademark because it was still a really brand new product. And if there had been A, B, C, or D, I could see why maybe there would be an issue of fact here, but there isn't, so I'm going to grant summary judgment. In my case, same judge. I said, hey, judge, remember that decision? Look what I've got here, A, B, C, D, and E. I've got them all. So he wrote a 60-page decision explaining why those weren't good enough. Summary judgment. If you're writing a 60-page summary judgment opinion, you're acknowledging that there are fact issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But he wasn't going to be stopped. He understood his business was to get rid of this case. That's an old problem. It's not unique to our moment. But still in all, we do go to law school. Maybe the joke was on us. And engage in the endeavor of trying to find the real meaning or the reasonable person's understanding of what words mean. So when you get to the point where a CNN reporter can stand in front of burning buildings and say,
mostly peaceful protest,
fiery, but mostly peaceful protest, you realize we're not there anymore. So then what is a society? Borders aren't borders. And so as a criminal defense lawyer, that's a big problem for you.
It's a huge problem. So, it used to be the case back when I was able to argue cases to juries, 2 years ago, that I would routinely use Cicero. And I would say, look, the Roman orator Cicero once said a republic, a res publica, a public thing, a commonwealth, isn't just any collection of people. It's a people bound together by common interest and a common conception of right. And you as jurors are the conscience of the community. You are the repositors of this conception of right. And the Constitution is our contract with one another. And for the following reasons, depending on the case, you should acquit. People don't read. I don't think we have common conceptions of right any longer. And I mean that in the most fundamental sense. I mean, when we have to argue about the pronouns that we use, or we have to argue about what we identify as in contradistinction to what we are, we've lost something fundamental. And to me, it's gone to the point of parody and absurdity. And the truly shocking thing is no one notices anymore. Now, I have given up. You mentioned CNN and the Chiron, fiery but mostly peaceful. I can't recall the last time I turned CNN on or MSNBC or Fox News. It's certainly more than a year. I've given up on cable news. I gave up on the New York Times for a while, but I've returned because somebody's got to try to cover the world. And the Wall Street Journal's okay, but I like the breadth of coverage. But I don't know where we go. I mean, I come to places like this and look to meet people like you, where I can recognize a sympathetic spirit who is struggling to find a common sense of truth in a tradition that I value. And for me, that's enough. I mean, and that's, it's not enough for the larger world, but it's going to have to be enough for today.
Right. You read my mind, because there's obviously going to be intelligent discussions among intelligent people of goodwill.
Yeah.
That will continue. But there was a time when what we call the media felt, or at least displayed, some sense of broader social responsibility. And the fascinating thing, again, both in the case of CNN, just as in the case of woke marketing, like in CNN, that they have no audience.
Yeah,
no one watches them. But as a business unit, they're somehow, at least in the medium run, seem to be insulated from caring about that. So what we saw with the New York Times was, over the last 5 years, a phenomenal thing that no one expected, which was they gave up on becoming reasonable or remaining reasonable and said, we can actually hold on to enough subscribers and advertisers who simply want to hear what they expect to hear and not be challenged, to make a pretty good business of this. And their revenue shot way up. So now they're only speaking to a very narrow sector. Now, of
Interesting.
Course, like you say, people don't read anymore. So it's not as if, all right, I mean, let's take a step back. You're talking to jurors.
Right.
I'm not worried that those jurors are reading the Times and because, like you said, no one's reading. Everything is based on, on entertainment. And here we are, guys, on the short end of the stick and getting friendly with the reaper, as you put it. By the way, I'll tell you something biblical or Talmudic. The rabbis say that before the time of Abraham, people didn't age. They just died when their time came. After reaching adulthood, that was just the look.
Yeah.
Like me, right? I still look 30.
You're not?
My problem was I looked 30 when I was 15.
Yeah.
They just died.
Yeah.
And God and God said, in the case of Abraham, in order to show him grace, because he was such a deserving person, that humanity would now age so that they could ease into the idea of mortality. Even though people, according to the Bible, lived hundreds of years,
right?
The longer you live, the more you get used to being alive.
Well, there is that, and the longer you live, the more you acquire aches and pains that make mortality make you feel like a used car. Let me, I want to return to this business about jurors. I've spent a lot of time in the last year.
You've tried hundreds of cases,
right?
Hundreds of cases. I'm in envy of you. I've tried like a half a dozen jury cases, which makes me, on the civil side, on the non, in other words, on people who are charging a relatively primo rate, a relatively experienced trial attorney. But someone like you who has really seen a lot of juries. I want those who don't know that, who are listening, to understand the perspective that that you.
So juries. The juries are the hardest working people in a courtroom, and they're the most afraid people. In the end, here's what a trial is. A trial is always a moral drama. It's about good and evil, and you're asking the jurors to do something. And when you walk into the courtroom, you should recognize it's a temple of fear, and everyone is responding to their fears. The judge's fear is a loss of control. The prosecutor's fear, I don't know, that I can't understand that. My fear is my own insecurity and the fear of adverse consequences to my client. But all the participants other than the jury know why they're there. They've developed some understanding of the case. They have some understanding of the rules. They have some expectation of what happens next. The jurors are entirely ignorant, and they're looking for a person to trust. And trials in the end become contests always between good and evil. And if you can't find good on your side of the aisle, you better damn well be sure you can create evil either on the bench or on the other side of the aisle, because the jury will follow good. They try to do the right thing. Let me read you a beautiful line that I hadn't noticed the first time I read, or paragraph, that I hadn't noticed the first time I read Orwell's 1984, but I'm rereading dystopian classics now because I think we live in dystopian times, and I'm looking for inspiration. So here is what Winston Smith, the protagonist in 1984, had to say about people who were off the grid, the so-called proles. They didn't quite matter. They were governed by private loyalties, which they did not question. What mattered were individual relationships, and a completely helpless gesture, an embrace, a tear, a word spoken to a dying man could have value in itself. The proles, it suddenly occurred to him, had remained in this condition. They were not loyal to a party or a country or an idea. They were loyal to one another. That to me speaks to our time. And that speaks to why I was so delighted to be with you again today, and why I look what I call for opportunities to create a handshake society or a handshake culture. Jurors are not part of the larger drama of our time. They're proles. I'm a prole. What was it? What did Hillary call us? I'm a deplorable, and a proud deplorable. The last thing I want to be is part of some self-righteous mob. Look what happened in New York this week. It was extraordinary. Mario Cuomo, the highest elected official of a state, was driven out of office by a self-righteous mob. And I'm not endorsing his conduct, but back in the day when we grew up, you do some of the things he did with a woman, you got yourself a slap in the face. You didn't get yourself a most wanted poster on CNN. But Cuomo, the highest elected official, was driven out of state, claiming the goalpost had shifted. He didn't realize he did wrong. He did no wrong. He protested his innocence, and he quit. He buckled under to a self-righteous mob. I'm outraged by that. So, I had a podcast that with a provocative title, Andrew, you pussy. I mean, he should have stuck by his guns because ordinary people voted for him. And I don't think most of us cared if he kissed somebody on the cheek or if he touched someone.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is the reason he quit was because his party decided he was no longer going to be a political asset. He was a liability. And nursing homes.
I know.
Morehouse Commission.
Yeah.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Future presidential candidate. Boob grab. You're out of here. Because that's the it's funny because I for years I said that the third rail in American social discourse now is racism, but I suppose anything likes.
I think it's become identity. It's bigger than race now, and I suspect the next 2 to 4 or 6 years will be the dissolution of our consensus about identity because there's only so far you can take it. I mean, I really don't think.
Okay, help me out. What is the consensus about identity that you think is going to be dissolved?
That identity is all there is. I mean, I think we're going to have to bounce back in the direction of something like character or excellence or some common good, because identity is fragmentary. And, I think at the margins, the proles, people like me, just aren't going to want to finance special, I'm not interested in potty politics. I don't think we should have to recraft every bathroom in the United States. I don't think that we should clog the courts with cases that saying a person born a man who wants to become a woman should compete in a woman's athletic event. To me, that is the height of absurdity. And I worry about the evolving 21st century and an emergent China. How are we going to respond to the first threat to our national security? A nation of wimps is not going to have much of a response, and that's what we're becoming.
Well, before you even got to the military point, I had already formulated my next question, which was based on an interview I did a couple of weeks ago. Oh no, it was only last week. What a long week it's been. Yeah. Especially for old people like us, the weeks are like nothing now, right?
No, I know. Who's playing in the Super Bowl?
So I interviewed this young man named Joe Kent, who's running for Congress out in Oregon. And he's on the side of the river next to Portland, which is red country.
Wolfville. Yeah.
No.
Okay. I got it. Yeah.
And he's a former Green Beret, Army Ranger, and he spent some time with the CIA. He's killed people, and he knows how to kill people. And I asked him, is there any institution in the United States, I wonder, other than the elite military formations in the United States, where no excuses are still accepted? There's no entitlement based on identity or being someone's child. I wouldn't say that about the entire military, because that's every bit as woke as Victoria's Secret and Ben and Jerry's. But these special ops guys and gals, his wife died in action. But these special ops guys, you've got, there's enough economic cushion that you say, we don't want to fund this. we haven't run out of money yet, and a decision was made, to just keep printing money. I mean, there's no accountability with what is done with public money, or corporate money, or foundation money, or consultant money. There's going to be a lot of money in the system to finance a lot of garbage for a very long time. And schmucks like us who work by the hour are going to completely, we're just watching the truck pull out of the driveway. But other than these very small units, it's very hard to identify too many areas, and maybe to some extent law profession, the legal practice is one. I mean, if you
I'd say trial lawyers, I may not be taking bullets, but I'm taking a lot. And trial lawyers are an opportunity to stand for something. And it's an unforgiving environment. It's a form of warfare. You either come back with your client or without him. And in the criminal context, and there are no excuses that are accepted.
That's why I would, my wife's father, of blessed memory, was a heart surgeon.
Oh, wow.
And she's a law school graduate. She got into one of the many law schools I didn't get into. And when we were first married, and she had already started, she was never a litigator. And when she saw what it was, even just being a junior litigator in a big firm, was all the more so as I got more of a front line kind of experience. She said, and I don't know if you know this, but no Jewish husband can ever meet the standards set by his father-in-law, alive or dead. I've got to admit, you litigators are the surgeons of the legal profession. And I always, after telling that story, I said, we may be, but the brain surgeons are the criminal defense lawyers. Yeah. Because that responsibility that you just described, I find it mind-boggling. Like you said, you come back with your client or without him. And, I've seen people lose money and lose their reputations and all the kinds of things, all the civil wrongs that can happen. And sometimes I can help them and sometimes I can't. But losing your freedom, and look at, you mentioned Sidney Powell's defense of General Flynn. Where was the criminal defense bar when a judge decided to appoint a private prosecutor answerable to him? That to me was that was the moment.
Yeah, no, I know.
And I just,
I had a great experience, one of the best experiences of my legal career last year. A good friend of mine's son is a student at an elite law school. I don't want to name it for reasons that become obvious in a moment. And so he asked, and because they did their classes by Zoom, he wanted the young man to have personal experience. So I agreed to tutor him in some of his first year classes throughout his first year. And we did con law and criminal law. We'll do some other courses this semester. And it forced me to reread a couple textbooks. And I'd meet with this kid for an hour or so each week and talk about the issues I spotted. Cool. And it brought the law alive to me again in ways that it hadn't been. And in watching him react, and before we began the semester, I had him read Locke's second treatise on government. And the reason for that was, look, Immanuel Kant once said that two things filled him with wonder. He said this in the Critique of Judgment, the moral law within and the starry heavens above and the moral law within. I said, there's a third thing that stuns me, and that is the phenomena of government, how perfect strangers acquired the right and the power to tell me what to do. Your job as a lawyer is to learn the metes and bounds of how that's justified, and on behalf of the individuals you represent, to challenge each and every restriction on individual liberty. Because our system of government comes out of a profound respect for individuals and liberty. And never forget for a moment that every courtroom you walk into is a gladiatorial arena, and you are standing between the crowd and your client. And the crowd will kill, consume, and restrict your client's liberty fight to the death. And the kid got it. It was so, and that is my attitude toward criminal courts. I like to joke with prosecutors. Connecticut's a very small state, so I meet you. You're on the other side. Ron, tough case I've got here, but I'm going to give you a choice now. There are two ways we can work this case out: my way and the hard way. You choose, but be careful what you wish for. And I can't imagine a better way to spend a living than standing next to somebody that everybody hates and saying, "You want them? You got to come through me to get them." I just can't imagine.
I and I'll tell you something else too. We talked at the beginning about those moments waiting in hallways, waiting at trial calls, cattle call trial calls we have in New York. Taking out these elite big firms, operators with their careerism and their in-house, trajectories to, high six-figure, low seven-figure annual push button.
I'm still available for one of those jobs, folks. 203-393-3017. If you're a big firm recruiter with $1 million to spare, looking for a mouth to rent, somebody who'd fight his own shadow in defense of liberty, can talk a mile a minute and can bill aggressively. That's me. 203-393-3017. All offers considered.
You're entirely too damaged goods. Entirely too damaged. If your podcast with me on your end didn't do it, this one will.
Yeah.
But aside from those people, and most of them actually, when you get down to it, the regular people.
Yeah.
I always found that hanging around with regular lawyers.
Yeah.
And I got to admit, I'm really talking about a male bonding experience.
Yeah, I hear you.
Waiting for a judge to come out, or even, some of my tenderest moments have been spent with adversaries while the jury's out.
Yeah.
Where we can really talk about honestly, before my humiliation or his, and the trial's over. What the hell? Can you believe she made that?
Oh, I know.
This judge ever even go to take an evidence class?
Yeah.
And they really don't know. I mean, you must be noticed. I mean, how did you enjoy that? Oh, my point was, what great guys most lawyers are.
Yeah, it's really true.
They're real, they're interesting people. They know how to think dialectically. This is, they recognize that there are multiple sides, that you have to be able to be an effective advocate. You need to be actually able to understand the other person's point of view.
Yep.
You don't have to accept it, but you need to understand it.
Well, I love appellate advocacy for that very reason.
It took me way too long to get into that, but I also really enjoy it.
I mean, for me, the best part of preparing for an appeal is the morning of argument. You're up at 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and you make one last read of your adversary's brief, and then you ask yourself the age-old question: how will I be humiliated today? And you come up with your response, and that's usually my opening line at argument. My adversary will say that I'm wrong because, well, that's not right, and it's just a great game. But I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No. This is the kind of give and take that I want to have. No, just on the one hand, the first point was that, you said there was nothing I would rather spend my time
doing. Yeah.
Hanging around with lawyers in an old musty state courthouse. There's something there's a kind of bonding there that I don't know if the younger crowd, I never forget, I was first day of trial. Oh no, it was just a scheduling conference, and I had a senior associate in one of my many previous firms shows up to federal court. I see him coming up with a backpack. And my eyes pop out, and like, I'm a pretty with it guy as an Orthodox Jewish middle-aged man goes, but I just never occurred to me that that an experienced lawyer would come to federal court, bring his stuff in a backpack.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, that's just old crusty get off my lawn stuff, I guess. But
there's a foxhole camaraderie. Years ago, I had a young woman working for one of the firms that I was a partner in, and she came back. She lost a trial, and she was really upset. And I said, well, you can't control the facts. You can't control the rulings. All you can control is what you can contribute. And I said, I have an observation to make. And I said, you come back from each trial the same person you were when they began. And unless you're leaving some skin on the floor, you haven't tried the case. Every trial should change you a little bit because you go to die.
Open them up.
Yeah.
Open them up.
And I think that process of bleeding together with your colleague, even if he's on the other side of the aisle, you develop foxhole camaraderie. And it's very rare that I don't develop very warm regard for the lawyer on the other side. There are a few, and I can name a couple of them instantaneously, that are such unctuous creeps that I wouldn't share a cab to a whorehouse with them. But for the most part,
write that one.
Yeah, but not that I go, but I've heard. But most people in the end, as you say, they're struggling with their own fears. They've been shat on, usually by the same judge, and you're both in terror. I remember one time the case turned out well for me, and I guess my adversary saw it before I did because we were awaiting a verdict, and he was vomiting into a drinking fountain in a federal court. Well, I just went and put my hand on his back. I said, "You all right? Are you all right?" And he says, "Yeah." And then he wasn't all right once the verdict came in. I was thrilled, but it was a big money case. It was a civil case. But it's moments like that you remember forever. The human contact. And
you forget every time you read an appeal, you realize how many opportunities there are to screw up.
Oh God, yeah.
Such and such, well, that might have been an interesting issue, but you didn't reserve that, or you didn't object. And there are real lawyers, real experienced lawyers, law firms you've heard of, who made this record of trial screw-ups or pre-trial screw-ups. And because it's a moving thing.
Yeah.
It's a living thing. And you're making decisions, and sometimes you decide not to act. And as we finish up, I'm very active talking on social media, especially Twitter. That's my place. Talking about the law. And one of the things I try to remind people when they second guess lawyers and outcomes is, if you don't have the red welt, you do not know.
Yep.
You don't know why the lawyer didn't ask that question. It seems so obvious to you they should have asked.
Yep.
You don't know why something wasn't responded to, because there might very well be a smoking gun in the direction that you're not aware of, or something that the client doesn't want made known, even though it would be, the killer response. You don't know. And you've got all these people second guessing what lawyers do. And these are obviously people who don't read a lot of cases because, and of course I'm talking about myself to some extent because I do a lot of high profile work and often for unpopular people. People like to, gang up and say, see, look, Laura Loomer's lawyer is so incompetent. Here's what he did. Because after all, if you hate Laura Loomer, her lawyer must be a terrible person also. And therefore, if he didn't respond to something in the time that whoever wrote the last filing said he should have responded to something, he must have done something wrong. Well, that's possible. Or there are other possibilities that you, as someone who has probably never really practiced law, wouldn't even dream of.
Well, and then too, I've never, I say to the young lawyers here, there's no right way to try a case. There are wrong ways. And my name's on the door. And so I'm here to police the standard of care, but go out and amaze me with something I hadn't thought about. Find your own way. But I can tell you in all of my cases, I could look at a transcript or even in a win thinking, I should have done this. I could have done that. Maybe next time I'll do this. I'm never satisfied with the record I've made. And one of the most painful experiences is reading your own record. That very issue. Why didn't I object to this? Well, what was I thinking? And the fact of the matter is, reality is complicated, and the judgments we make in the moment. And there is an acceptable range of the standard of care. And some days I'll rule some days I'll object on this grounds, some days on another, some days I'll have the presence of mind to do both. And there may be days that I forget because I'm thinking about something else. That's life. That's life in the court.
Human person. And that's why the law, like medicine, is really an art.
Yep.
you need to know the science to apply to be successful as an artist, but the art comes when you master the tools, then you apply your whatever magic you may or may not have. And we need to do this much more regularly.
We do. Thank you so much for having me. And let me say to you, Mazel Tov.
or something, I'm sure.
Something, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll take it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me, Ron. Bye.
So long.